Welcome to Citizens History. My name is Podrick Rowan. I'm here with my co-host, J. Matt Ward, and we are delighted to welcome Adam Klempner. I will let him introduce himself, but I will just say off the bat that he and I met in Istanbul many moons ago, and he remains one of my favorite people on the planet. And our topic tonight is, well, we will start with Palestine and Israel, and no doubt the conversation will branch out from there, but I'm looking forward to a very wide-ranging conversation. So welcome, Adam, and could you say a few words
Thank
to
you.
introduce yourself?
Would I like to introduce myself?
Yeah, just I could introduce you, but I'd prefer that you do it. Just
Okay.
I can definitely elaborate on one of my favorite people and one of the most brilliant people I know.
All right. Well, I'm very flattered. I was born in California. I grew up in Israel. I've lived in the States, and for the past 21 years now, I've lived in Istanbul, Turkey, where I teach 5-year-olds English. I'm both an English teacher and a class teacher. So.
And I just want to add to that Adam has language skills that I would die for. I spent only 8 years in Turkey, and I'm just not only Turkish, not only Hebrew, but also Arabic. And he's quite an Ottoman scholar as well, even though he doesn't have any initials after his name.
That was in the past life.
Yes. I'm like a prophet without a book. I liken you, rightly or wrongly, to someone like Freeman Dyson, the famous physicist who never got his PhD. He managed. Well, that's another story entirely. But I would love to start with one of the things that living in Turkey, as you do, helped me to understand about what's going on, not only currently since October 7th in Israel, Palestine, but also historically, also going back just a very long time, is the extent to which in the Muslim world, we just have a real inflamed opinion. We've got a real anti-Israel sentiment all over the place. And I ran across all sorts of casual anti-Semitism all the time in Turkey that at first shocked me, right? But maybe Adam, if you could, I've run across, young professionals, young women who look almost like teeny boppers, they're in their early mid-20s or something like that. And I've heard them say things like, well, Hitler should have finished what he started. He was right, and he should have finished what he started. To what extent
I've never been directly the target of this, by the way, but certainly online there's loads of material of that sort.
Yeah.
So, and I do remember one such, actually, it wasn't directed at me because she didn't know my identity, but one of my students back when I was teaching some casual comment about the Jews being a cursed people. So.
Yeah. I mean, there's something deeply ironic I always found about this, because historically speaking, going back all through the last 2,000 years, historically speaking, if you asked any semi-historically literate person anywhere in the globe, okay, who are the most anti-Semitic people anywhere? You'd have to conclude Christians. You'd have to conclude specifically Western Christians, but and there's just all sorts of history that we could elaborate on over the past 2,000 years. But I think it's fair to say that today, if you asked that same question, it would be the most generally anti-Semitic people on the globe are in the Muslim world.
Yeah.
And that's not to pat Westerners on the back, and that's not to finger wag at Muslims. There are a lot of historical reasons why this is the case, but I was wondering if you had a perspective on that.
Well, the only thing that I find really striking about this is how materials that came out of a one world, so materials out of Western anti-Semitism, have been adopted so enthusiastically and pretty much wholesale sometimes by people in the Islamic world. So whether we're talking about the Elders of Zion or um, stuff about the Rothschilds and all that kind of stuff, it's there's very little that's actually original. So
Yeah, speaking of, well, could you give a tiny bit of background? Not all our listeners will understand what the protocols of the Elders of Zion are.
well, as far as I recall, they were written by a Russian um, kind of, we could say, writer and propagandist, um, who, if I'm not mistaken, moved to the US at some point. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm I'm not an expert on that, but in the early 20th century, it was a very popular source for anti-Semitic um, propaganda.
Yeah. One of the things I'm currently teaching a class on, well, we're talking about a lot of things, but the class is on capitalism. And we just got done with a unit on the Russian Revolution and on Stalin. And it's very significant that in both totalitarianisms of the 20th century, both the right-wing version in Hitler and in the left-wing version of, Stalin and Lenin, you had this visceral, all of these conspiracy theories are on full display. Stalin said, well, every Jew is a nationalist and an agent of American intelligence. And of course, Hitler had his own, uh, fever dreams on display in Mein Kampf.
Well,
But
it's not really surprising, is it though? I mean, when you have, I would say, totalitarian countries, fascist regimes, generally look for an enemy. And if the enemy is already, there in the lore of that country, then that makes it all the more convenient. It's of course much harder to create an enemy out of nowhere, some group that no one ever felt any kind of enmity or prejudice against.
right,
So whether it's left wing or right wing, it's just as convenient. Well, plus in the case of in the case of Stalin, many of the people that he was trying to get rid of in the Communist Party, many of his rivals, especially in the early years, were in fact Jewish. So, I mean, right up to Trotsky himself. So, and well, of course, there's always in the Soviet context, there's always the accusation of cosmopolitanism. Being just too international for our taste, kind of idea.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
And the
kind of
exact
ironic
same
for
thing on the other side,
a
too.
presumably an ostensibly universal communist movement to turn cosmopolitanism into a fault or something to be blamed for, but nonetheless, it was quite useful. And
I don't know, maybe we lost Podrick.
yes, it looks like it.
Well, while we're waiting, I can. You said you grew up in Israel. How many years before you moved to Istanbul?
Well, I lived in Israel until I was about 25, and
Mm,
then I moved to the States.
mm,
Um, I lived for 8 years in Chicago,
okay.
and then I went to Istanbul, where I've lived for the past 21 years, since 2002, actually.
Okay. Cool.
So,
Sorry about that, Patrick. I asked him a question when it seemed like you dropped out for a second.
No, you're good. Did the recording stay? It looks like it's still going.
It should
okay,
be still going.
Okay, okay.
looks like it, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
That's all right. You're at university, so the internet there can go in and out. It can be kind of
Yeah.
patchy sometimes.
Yes, absolutely.
So, where do we go from this? Nazism
Well,
and communism, both having a convenient enemy.
well, we could transition to one of the reasons, even apart from the state of Israel, which is many Muslims' stated reason why uh, you have a lot of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. Apart from and prior to that, Hitler did an extremely good job with anti-Jewish propaganda in the Muslim world in the 1930s and into the war. Uh, are you familiar with that history at all? Um, one of the,
Not in
I
terms
mean,
of publications, no.
oh, I mean, there are a couple of books that I've read about this. That I don't have them off the top of my head. I'm just thinking of there's been a lot of good work on the ways in which Hitler's propaganda has uh, really penetrated, really did a great job, particularly in the Middle East, but throughout the Muslim world. Um, you know, stirring up sentiment against Jews. Um,
Okay. I mean, in Turkey, the only thing I can say is that anti-Semitic sentiment is not so unique.
yeah, yeah,
In the sense that there is also prejudice and that there are negative feelings towards other ethnic groups, other religious groups as well. So I sometimes jokingly say to people who protest anti-Semitism in this country that in Turkey that is that we're not that special. there's there's plenty of a sentiment against any and all minorities. So,
all
but
too true.
the only thing I that comes to mind right away is, of course, which is of course also frequently used as a propaganda fodder by the likes of Netanyahu, is the famous meeting of the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, with Hitler.
Yeah, he traveled to Berlin.
Yes, yes, that famous meeting is, of course, frequently used in such materials. So, but actual publications, I'm sure they existed. I just don't know them by name.
Yeah. I was just doing a talk last week on this subject and, with a few students and faculty. And uh, one of the students who was not born in the West Bank, but his family, his grandmother is still alive there in the West Bank. The family was displaced from East Jerusalem in 1948, and they came to settle someplace north of there in the West Bank. I'm forgetting the exact spot. But one of the things he said stuck out to me. He said, "Look, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm just anti-Israel." And
Okay.
yeah, to what extent does this? I can see where he's coming from. To what extent does this make sense? And can we, if at all, parse the state of Israel from Judaism more broadly in any kind of realistic way?
I mean, if you're asking my opinion, I think of course it's possible. I mean, and certainly, well, from the point of view of a Palestinian living in the West Bank, that's, well, to some degree quite logical. I mean, of course, he would have feelings of enmity towards Israel. You know, relations between Israelis and Palestinians have always been very problematic. But being able to separate that and say, okay, I have negative feelings about Israel, but that doesn't extend to Jews worldwide. That's, well, in a sense, quite reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, the only thing is, of course, of course, you have to listen to exactly what people say, yes? Exactly how they frame their opinions on this. I think a lot of times it's less problematic for a Palestinian to speak this way than for a person observing as a third party who isn't involved.
Right.
And also, I would say a lot of times the areas where there's a kind of overlap between the two is when you have, I would say, more politicians, you know, people who are or activists, people who are in the public eye, who express views against Israel, not you know, Israeli policies, but the very existence of Israel, or who seem to object to the violence that the Netanyahu government wreaks on the people of Gaza, far more than they seem to be troubled about any other form of violence on earth. And as we know quite well, there's plenty of violence in many countries, even in the Middle East. In Yemen, for example, hundreds of thousands were killed in the conflict. Of course, there was the American activity in Iraq. You have violence in places in the Sudan and Chad and those areas. But there seems to be a lot more of a concern with violence when it comes to Israelis and Palestinians than many other places. But that in itself, I mean, expressing criticism of that in itself is not anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I mean, before I follow up on that, could I ask for a little bit more background? You know, what was it like to grow up in Israel? And you did your military